Um, Welcome, everyone, to today's program, sponsored by the Plant Initiative, Strangers at Home, Plant-Human Migrations, a conversation with Yota Batsaki and Giovanni Aloi. I'm Paul Moss, Executive Director of the Plant Initiative, and I'm very excited to introduce Yota and Giovanni and to start off our 1-hour program. Dr. Yota Batsaki is the Executive Director of Dumbarton Oaks, a Harvard Research Institute, museum, and historic garden located in Washington, D.C. At Dumbarton Oaks, she also directs the Plant Humanities Initiative. Through an open access digital platform, the Plant Humanities Lab, and related scholarly programming, the initiative helped pioneer and continues to support the emerging field of plant humanities. Yota holds a PhD in comparative literature from Harvard University, and she has co-edited 4 volumes: The Botany of Empire in the Long 18th Century, Imperial Geographies in Byzantine and Ottoman Space, Fictions of Knowledge, Fact, Evidence, Doubt, and with Anatole Chikin, the forthcoming Plant Humanities, to be published by Dumbarton Oaks in 2026. With Sir Peter Crane, she is currently editing the first handbook of plant humanities, which will include contributions by plant scientists, humanists, and curators of plant-focused collections. Dr. Giovanni Aloi is an author, educator, and curator specializing in the representation of nature and environment in art. He is the editor-in-chief of Antennae, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture, and teaches art history and visual culture at the School of Art Institute in Chicago. Giovanni has written and edited many books, including Art and Animals, Why Look at Plants, The Vegetal Emergence in Contemporary Art, Posthumanism in Art and Science, Estado Vegetal, and most recently, Botanical Revolutions, How Plants Change the Course of Art, I'm Not an Artist, Reclaiming Creativity in the Age of Infinite Content, and Lawn. Giovanni has contributed to BBC Radio, PBS TV, worked at Whitechapel Art Gallery and Tate Galleries in London, and currently is USA correspondent for S Magazine. Giovanni is also a board member of the Plant Initiative. The program today will start with a 20-minute presentation by Yota, followed by 10 minutes of discussion between Yota and Giovanni. For the remainder of the program, Yota will be responding to questions posed by you, the attendees, that will be presented by Giovanni as selected from questions that are posted in the Zoom chat. So we encourage you to suggest a question for Yota to discuss by posting it in the chat, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. This program is being recorded and will be posted online on the Plant Initiative's YouTube channel, and a link to the recording will be sent to everyone who registered. With that, I'm turning over the program to Giovanni.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you all for coming here today. Thank you, Yota, for being with us. It's such a pleasure to see you again and to have the opportunity to talk about your research as well as to discover more about the exciting opportunities and activities of Dumbarton Oaks. I'm so glad that I was able to visit last year and be part of one of your programs and witness in person the incredible collection of books and manuscripts, but also get a sense of how important the work at Dumbarton Oaks is from an ecological perspective, but also from the possibility and opportunities that are being created for multidisciplinary knowledge and knowledge exchange. I also wanted to mention that one of the reasons why I've become interested in Yota's work over time is because Yota has also written about contemporary art, noticeably 2 wonderful essays, one on the work of Ansel Kiefer and the other one on the work of Precious Okoyomon. Today, we're going to hear more about Yota's research, more in general, and again, focus also on her activities at Dumbarton Oaks. Without any further ado, Yota, please.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. It was wonderful to have you with us last year, and we have to get you back to Dunbar Noaks. And thank you, Paul, for everything you both have done to make it possible to be here. I'm really, really glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see that well? Great. And I wanted to start by explaining the methodology I bring to this question of plant and human mobilities that we are discussing today. And that speaks to the project that Giovanni mentioned and Paul mentioned at Dunbar Noaks. So for the past decade or so, I have directed an initiative at Dunbar Noaks under the rubric of Plant Humanities, which explores the myriad ways plants have shaped human cultures. And I show you here our webpage with some of our key areas of activity. A major output of our work is the Plant Humanities Lab, an open access website that publishes cultural histories of plants for students and the public. While drawing from the environmental humanities and related fields, our methodology has three distinctive features. First, we focus on individual species and plant families, rather than plants in the abstract, to explore specific evolutionary and cultural histories. Secondly, we draw heavily on plant collections, whether herbaria, botanical gardens, or archives of botanical art and publication, as primary sources for rigorous storytelling of urgent contemporary relevance. And lastly, and for today's discussion, the project emphasizes plant mobility. We tend to think of plants as rooted to the spot, but they travel constantly through their adaptations for nourishment and reproduction. And in the modern period, this movement occurred in tandem with massive displacement of people. These often involuntary and violent migrations of plants and people gave rise to the plantation system that transformed landscapes and communities and ultimately helped shape our modern world. The history of these plant transfers began with Alfred Crosby's seminal 1972 The Columbian Exchange, and has grown over the past 50 years to acknowledge the botanical contributions of enslaved people from the African diaspora and the erased and appropriated knowledge of indigenous communities, thanks to the work of scholars like Judith Carney and Robin Kimmerer, among others. I propose in this talk that no instance of plant mobility provokes more resistance than the spread of invasives. Our response to them is mired in paradox. Invasive species are carried around the globe and often thrive in landscapes disrupted by humans, yet they escape and challenge our putative mastery of nature. They interfere not only with capitalist productivity, but even with seemingly benign notions of sustainability and ecosystem services that imagine nature as a big marketplace. Invasives are therefore marked out among all plant categories for the most negative forms of personification. The language we use to describe them, as Banu Subramaniam has shown, and I saw Banu's name in the list, is that of aliens and intruders, ecological villains that invite militaristic discourses of eradication. Because their triumph is both abetted by humans and oblivious to human ends, invasives offer a unique lens on the accelerated exploitation of nature in the modern period. Ironically, as Alfred Crosby was one of the first to argue, foreign weeds were the constant companions of European arrivals in the Americas, their success intimately tied to the exploitative practices of white settler colonialism. More recently, Anna Singh has proposed that the feral proliferation of invasives and pests is the other side of plantation monoculture. In her telling, the modular simplification of complex ecosystems paves the way for opportunistic invaders and intruders. The scandalous mobility of invasives therefore unsettles, as I propose, because it holds up a mirror to the worst excesses of the Anthropocene. And now to one of my obsessions. Over the past few years, I have been fascinated by a particular invasive known in the United States as the vine that ate the South. Kudzu, scientific name Poeraria lobata. When I said that Plant Humanities values historic collections as sources of new inspiration, I speak from experience. It was a collection item that opened my eyes to Kudzu as a window into important environmental and cultural histories. And I show you here the rare book collection at Dumbarton Oaks, which was really a source of inspiration for the Plant Humanities Initiative because it's very rich in botanical publications and botanical art. So one day, soon after launching the Plant Humanities Initiative with a Mellon grant, I was called over to the Rare Book Library by my colleague and close collaborator, Anatol Chikin, whom Paul mentioned earlier, to see a new acquisition, a 19th century Japanese agricultural treatise on Kudzu with beautiful woodcut illustrations by a student of Hokusai. Having only heard of Kudzu as the invasive vine that ate the 20th century American South, I was intrigued by this book. Written by Okura Nagatsune, an agricultural reformer, the treatise praises Kudzu as a useful plant in useless places, an antidote to rural famines, a source of raw material for textiles and paper, and a valued medicinal plant in its native China, Korea, and Japan. How could a plant so abhorred in its American context be so lovingly described in poems and paintings in its native region? And here is a painting of the Kudzu flower, also from the Dumbarton Oaks collection. I then discovered that Kudzu was the protagonist in a series of images by a pioneer of color photography, William Christenberry, who was born in Alabama but worked and taught in DC. Actually, his studio was around the corner from my house. Christenberry returned every summer to Hale County, Alabama, to photograph the overgrown landscapes that I came to realize were former cotton plantations. His photographs helped me pick up the thread of Kudzu's presence in the American South. The telltale patch of red Alabama soil that you see in the middle of the photograph provides a clue. Like many other plants first introduced as ornamentals, Kudzu arrived in the United States in the 1876 Centennial Exposition and was proposed as an adornment for southern porches. But Kudzu didn't escape from the garden in the manner of many invasives. Rather, it was deliberately planted all over the South by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps that you see in action here, to stem the rampant soil erosion brought on by plantation monoculture. The modern expanse of Kudzu maps onto the former cotton belt, making it the successor of cotton and an emblem of what art historian John Barrell has called the dark side of the landscape. The blanket of Kudzu conceals layers of violent displacement that produced enduring historical and ecological trauma, starting from the dispossession and forcible removal of indigenous peoples, the abduction and enslavement of people from Africa and their descendants, the flow of big capital and the rise of the plantation system, and the blow to the cotton industry dealt by a pest, the boll weevil, which triggered further displacement from the countryside into the cities for poor Black and white sharecroppers. By the 1930s, the exhausted soil was flowing into the sea. The rapid depletion of valuable farmland led to widespread panic, sparing a massive bioengineering project to grow kudzu in government nurseries and subsidize its planting over millions of acres. The plant was described then as the miracle vine for its soil stabilizing and nitrogen fixing capacity, but it was also finicky and had to be coaxed into growth before it became the vine that ate the South. Early warnings of kudzu's invasiveness were ignored. Hugh Bennett, the father of soil conservation, as he was known, insisted that the planting of kudzu was informed by the best science of the time. By the 1950s, the tide had turned, and in 1998, kudzu was pronounced a federal noxious weed. Kudzu spread is a sobering example of those feral proliferations that, according to Anna Singh, result from the plantation logic of monoculture. Because the scandalous mobility of invasives is not only a biological, but also a historical phenomenon, it affords opportunities for exploring and even figuring, representing human and social dislocations. This is an installation that both Giovanni and I love and are very interested in. It appeared in the 2022 Venice Biennale. It was the final cavernous space of the Arsenale that was given over to this indoor installation by the artist Precious Okoyomon, titled "To See the Earth Before the End of the World." The installation featured kudzu alongside a plantation plant more familiar to a global audience, sugarcane. And by contrast to Kristen Berry's photographs that I showed you earlier, which are always devoid of people, Okoyomon's practice restored the human presence to the landscape through a series of sculptures made of brown wool mixed with soil and blood. The sculptures suggest the toiling bodies on the plantation, but their gestures are not those of toil. They gracefully lean forward or sink into the vines in a poignant and subtle memorialization. The artist disrupts the sterile environment of the art gallery by inviting an invasive plant inside and allowing it, through its rampant growth, to co-produce the installation. This move exemplifies powerful currents in contemporary aesthetic and ethical practice that seek to restore animation and agency to non-human or more than human entities. But the installation also activates invasives as transplants that speak to violent histories. Kudzu for Okoyomon is an allegory for Black life in America, its marginalization, criminalization, and irrepressible resilience. The beings brought together in To See the Earth Before the End of the World, kudzu, sugarcane, black swallowtail butterflies, human visitors, and sundry soil inhabitants are not elements of a native ecosystem. They are part and parcel of the migrations that have shaped the Anthropocene, coming together in an aesthetic assemblage that suggests new ruderal ecologies of coexistence and belonging, of old and new life, taking root and even thriving in the margins and wastelands of our damaged world. Okoyomo's 21st century garden may seem far from Nagatsune's 19th century agricultural treatise, but the plant, as biological organism, historical artifact, and migrant form, is the thread that ties them together. Understanding kudzu's invasiveness is impossible without the resources of the humanities, historical contextualization, attending to the particularities of place and community, cross-cultural comparison. And yet these elements are missing from the 2023 report by the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, quite a mouthful, I said it, that warns of invasive alien species as a major global threat to biodiversity and human well-being. The report quantifies their impact on national infrastructure, food security, human health, ecosystem services, but is devoid of the social and natural histories that explain their spread. Invasive species are not simply a biological fact. They are, as botanist Peter Del Tredici has argued, biocultural entities, and their future management cannot be separated from their past environmental and cultural histories. In the rest of my presentation, I would like to go a step further and propose that once we acknowledge the presence of invasives in the landscape, we may find that they have the capacity to unsettle our deep-seated notions of home and belonging. And to do this, I would like to take you now to the place where I grew up, Greece, and to a period of war and dislocation almost exactly a century ago, in the early 20th century. My research here is again prompted by an encounter with the archive, in this case, a body of work by the Greek photographer Eli Suyouzoglou Seraidari, known professionally as Nelly's. Her archive is at the Batsaki Museum in Athens, and I saw it a couple of years ago, in a wonderful exhibition there. Nelly's grew up in Asia Minor, the coast of Turkey that you see on the right, but left the region as part of the Greek-Turkish War and the massive displacement that followed in 1922-23. After World War I, Greece, who had fought on the side of the Allies, was encouraged by the Treaty of Sèvres to reclaim the Asia Minor coast as the Ottoman Empire was breaking apart. This coast was the former location of the flourishing Greek cities of antiquity. And so this dream of expansion furthered the nationalist dream of expanding the Greek state to its former ancient and Byzantine glories, as can be seen from this map from 1922. But the Greek invasion ended in defeat, violent reprisals, and a humanitarian disaster that prompted the great powers to orchestrate an exchange of populations, mandated by a new treaty signed in Lausanne in 1923. The goal, as described by one of the architects of the treaty, Lord Curzon, was to end the ongoing conflict by means of a radical unmixing of peoples. This double uprooting of people, decided solely on the basis of religion, saw 1 million Orthodox Christians leave their ancestral lands in Asia Minor, while 250,000 Muslims were forced to abandon their long-established communities in Greece. Curzon, who was the former Viceroy of India, Curzon was the former Viceroy of India, and so the Greek-Turkish exchange of populations is considered a precedent for later nation-state engineering, such as the partitioning of India and Pakistan. Back to our photographer. Nellis was a member of an affluent family who escaped the worst of the atrocities. While her relatives established themselves in Athens, she went to Germany to study photography and opened a studio in Athens in 1924. Her best-known photos from this period appear oblivious to the Asia Minor devastation and its aftermath, projecting instead an image of modern Greece in direct descent from classical antiquity, serene and orderly. Nelly's aesthetic was influenced by similar forces as that of Leni Riefenstahl, the pioneering filmmaker whose work has been viewed as complicit with Nazi propaganda. The Greek photographer is known for a series she produced in the 1920s and 30s of dancers and athletes photographed in the nude in important archaeological sites, such as the Parthenon. These photographs, which scandalized interwar Athenian society, drew on traditions of the classical nude, and in fact, male subjects were often portrayed in postures resembling classical statuary. But they also appear to be influenced by German ideals of the idealized Aryan body. During this period, Nellis worked on official campaigns for the dictatorship of Ioannis Metaxas, which projected an uninterrupted line of transmission of ancient Greek forms and beauty ideals from antiquity to the present. Her imagery contributed to the Greek state's promotion of the country abroad through her official photography of the Delphic Games, her posters for international tourism campaigns, and her assignment by the Ministry of Press and Tourism to populate the walls of the Greek Pavilion at New York's 1939 World Fair with photographs and large collage. Nelly's collage that you see here combine images of ancient statues and modern Greek faces, engineered to demonstrate their enduring similarities, positing a blood and soil purity and continuity through time. Collage is the artistic mode for constructing a whole by suturing together fragments and parts. The technique bolts things together, but also, wittingly or unwittingly, exposes their seams and discontinuities. Where are the plants? This aesthetic of juxtaposition and superimposition is also to be found in Nelly's iconic images of cultural landscapes. And these images are indicative for me of how plants leave a residue in discourse, a seam that exposes the bad faith of ideology. Consider the plants framing this image of the Parthenon, the most privileged and indeed sacred archaeological site of the nascent Greek state, and of Hellenism broadly conceived. The plants, as you can tell, are Agave americana, a native of Mexico and an introduced species that I grew up considering an essential element of the Greek landscape. Cacti like agave and prickly pear were among the first plants brought by Columbus to Europe due to their novelty and potential utility. By the 16th century, agave was present in botanical gardens in Europe, and the plant became a prized botanical curiosity in 17th century Europe, its rare flowering commemorated in rare prints and lavish publications like the one you see on the right. And I'm showing you here the first screenshot of the cultural history on agave on the Plant Humanities Lab by our former postdoctoral fellow, Ashley Buchanan. So if you want to hear more about or read more about agave and its trip to Europe from the Americas, this is the first place you can look. Eventually, agave escaped the botanical garden to populate Southern Europe. The assimilation of agave into the Greek landscape imaginary attests to the place-making capacity of plants, even those that are foreign introductions. In Nelly's photographs of archaeological sites, they are disquieting elements of the spirit of place. Less known than the photographer's images of iconic Greek sites, such as the Parthenon, Sparta, here at the feet of Taygetus, or the Odeon of Herodes Atticus, all framed by Agave, is a very different set of photos she took of the refugees of Asia Minor that I was mentioning earlier, pouring into Greece at the same time, destitute, dressed in threadbare clothes, and living in the most precarious circumstances. Often they are photographed as if planted in the arid landscape in the manner of plants. Their precarious existence and halting integration are evinced by the ramshackle structures and open-air kitchens that sustain them, their suffering and resilience conveyed by the way they clutch protectively and tenderly their children. The presence of these Greeks from Anatolia, many of whose ancestors had never set foot on the Greek mainland, and who themselves often did not speak Greek, provoked a strong backlash from the natives. The refugees were called pejoratively Turkish seeds, Turkospori, and they were accused of bringing with them disease, crime, and competition for scarce jobs and bridegrooms. And yet their presence transformed and enriched Greek culture, cuisine, music, politics, and the economy. Like the naturalized Agave, their images haunt and undo the fiction of the nation state, even as it is being fabricated in the tourist campaigns and the projection of Greece abroad that Nellis was also involved in. They are an uncanny reminder of nationalism's artificial construction of community as unmixed and homogeneous. Plants provide, as we've often talked with Giovanni, our most potent metaphors for human movement, for uprooting, transplantation, diaspora. While Kudzu, with which I began, became an invasive by being deliberately planted in some of the most devastated and abjected landscapes of the US South, Agave is an escapee and a naturalized alien that frames some of the most hallowed and revered archaeological sites of the emerging Greek state. Yet both in their different characters and trajectories are strangers at home. They alert us to the foundational presence of difference right at the heart of the imagined community of the nation, and they remind us of how the constant migrations of human and more than human beings undo and expose narrow notions of purity and belonging. Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Yota. So much territory, and you've mobilized so much. I just wanted to draw a couple of considerations because obviously you showed images of the installation by Precious Okoyomon at the Venice Biennale in 2022, which I also enjoyed. And I oftentimes with my students draw a connection to another installation from 2018 by architects Barako White and Linda Tegg, who at the Australian Pavilion of the Architecture Biennale filled the space with native plants that traveled all the way from Australia to Italy 6 months prior to the opening of the Venice Biennale and were hatched in nurseries around northern Italy. One of them was in San Remo, I believe, and then the plants were shipped to the Australian Pavilion for the opening of the installation. And the clear message that was being conveyed with the beautiful reconstruction of a swath of Australian land was this metaphorical alignment between Aboriginal people and the native plants that have been destroyed. Bringing those back equates to a bringing back of a level of strata that is factual and also cultural and biological. And I think that there's always, these complexities are always haunting our considerations on weeds. I think you've been particularly brave, and it'd be interesting to hear from the audience as well, at sort of accepting or welcoming the traveling plants. And I know that probably there are different feelings in that respect. And there is something I think that's very important, nonetheless, in this natives good and plants that have come from elsewhere potentially bad. There's a dangerous polarization in the conceptions of critical plant studies that I think we have the responsibility to push back. And I think it's in part what you're doing here, if not entirely what you're doing here. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about your overall perspective on this. You know, the kind of good plant, bad plant situation that oftentimes haunts us in critical plant studies. But also, how do we realign or, in a sense, do justice to the ecological considerations that are also implied when plants take over? I think you've illustrated different kinds of takeover. For instance, I grew up, my parents moved to the north of Italy during the 1960s, but they're from Calabria, which has a very intimate history connected to Greece. And I am very familiar with agave and prickly pears as part of the landscape. And it was only about 10 or 15 years ago that I learned that they were actually not natives, because they're absolutely everywhere and they're beautiful. They're incredibly iconic plants. And that's why I also have about 17 agaves in pots in my garden right now. And I also have 2 prickly pears. And I think there's a way perhaps in which the prickly pears and the agave have managed to assimilate themselves in the culture and ecology of these geographical areas that is not quite the way in which Kudzu is overwhelmingly smothering the landscape. So sorry, I put a lot there on your plate, but I can also help you to like re-navigate the threads if you need to. But I saw you taking notes because you're very, very,
I
very and so
was trying. Yes.
start
I'm
wherever you
so
like.
I'm sorry I didn't see the installation of native plants that you mentioned in the previous pavilion, and I think you're absolutely right. I think what is really interesting about that, not having seen it, is how the placemaking capacity of plants that I referred to, and how we travel with plants, and how plants can help us travel to places not physically but through their very presence. So I think there is something very, again, poignant about the Australian kind of territory or sense of place traveling through the plants. And you also mention the investment of care that went into making that exhibition possible, that installation possible, right, by nurturing them abroad. So they're traveling even as they constitute the essence of the territory abroad. And these forms of care and belonging are very important. And I don't mean to downplay them. The association, as you said, with Indigenous people is very meaningful and very important. And at the same time, we know that autochthony and notions of autochthony have been given very sinister cast in the past, like the idea of a people naturally inhabiting a soil, naturally having an attachment to the plants. We know from scholars like Joachim Voske-Buhlmann and others about this idea in Germany in the 30s, that there is a natural connection between the people and a place, and other beings don't belong. So I think it really depends on the historical and social and political context that we are interrogating. And so, is there a good plant and a bad plant? I think we're moving away, right? And thanks to you and thanks to the work of other scholars, from these dualities. What interests me in Kudzu and plants like Kudzu is how the same plant can have very different characters in different historical and cultural and geographical context. So we see, that's why I wanted to show it as a famine plant, an ornamental plant, a forage plant. At some point, it was being explored as a forage plant. So there is no good and bad plant, and there are no, some people say, I don't know, invasive species. There are plants that demonstrate invasive behaviors, and those behaviors are linked to our invasive behavior and our disruption of ecosystems. My thinking on this is also, I think, informed by the discussions with plant scientists and biologists, and often in those conversations, what comes through is there is no one-size-fits-all approach to invasive species. It really depends on the context again. Are we trying to preserve a refugium of rare, endemic, or endangered plants where it's really important to get rid of them to preserve other unique evolutionary trajectories that these endemics display? Or is the remedy worse than the problem? You know, are we using so many pesticides, and is it a fight that we're not going to win? So plants have really complex histories, just as we do, and we can't really, I think, stick to these categories of good and bad thing.
Yeah,
Does that
absolutely.
go some way toward? I don't know if
No, it
there's something
definitely
that.
does. Definitely does. And I think it brings me actually back to the Plant Humanities Lab. And it was nice. It's a resource, it's an incredible resource that I recommend everyone who's here today or is watching the recording of this conversation should visit. I use it extensively with my students. And what I really appreciate is the situatedness, you know, focusing on a species, so focusing on a specific historical, scientific milieu, cultural milieu, to me represents a solid foundation in our inquiries with plants. Even when they travel around, it's interesting to see how they can inhabit, as you pointed out, different milieus at once, how they become sedimentations of different cultures and histories that pop up somewhere else and acquire new meaning as they travel across the world. Now, there is a consideration here because I know, and you know as well, that it's very difficult not to instantly fall into the tropes that we know. And even if I agree with you that there is no bad plant and good plant as such, and we need to move beyond these strictures, I wonder if there's something still that is not necessarily related to the species of plant, but how the plant behaves that might be telling in this context. And I'm wondering about if we want to tap into the metaphor of migration and consider the way agave and prickly pear have inserted themselves, the way in which they're not taking over the countryside, but finding their ecological niches and thriving through them and supporting other species where perhaps there was room for doing so. I wonder if there's a way in which perhaps what Kudzu does might help us to understand that sometimes, or in many occasions, it's not the people that are become problematic in the context of migration, but it's the modality of migration and how perhaps it's not somewhat guided or mitigated or orchestrated in a way that allows a certain possibility for an integration into a landscape. So I'm kind of like weaving different metaphors together. Because whenever I think about agaves and prickly pears in Greece and the south of Italy, it's interesting how they don't grow everywhere and they don't smother other plants and how both kind of give. And that's kind of interesting too. So that also kind of made me think about Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, which is a refrain that oftentimes pops up in my head, especially also in collaboration with Anna Tsing, you know, these ideas of what do we do since we cannot and should not think that we should pull ourselves out of the equation. How do we ecologically and culturally negotiate these realities once we have in many ways created them?
I'm thinking of conversations we've had about the opposite tendency almost that predominates now in some areas of plant studies or critical plant studies to consider plants as always benevolent, as icons or as models of what a communal, interdependent, collaborative community should look like. And we know that plants are also very competitive, and that there are plants that exude toxins so that nothing else can grow around them, so that they can claim the territory. So one thing that I hope I'm not falling into is a sentimentality or a facile personification of plants as these always benevolent elements in the landscape. The other thing that comes to mind is I recently discovered a book that I wish I'd known earlier when I was starting to think about Kudzu, which is a social history of the prickly pear in South Africa. It's called The Prickly Pear, Social History in the Eastern Cape by William Beinart and Luvuyo Wochela. And I discovered this in a wonderful presentation by Dr. Wochela in a seminar called Plant Lives, out of Wits University, organized by Isabel Hofmeier and Sarah Nuttall. Long story short, it was a wonderful presentation on this book that came out about 10 years ago about the prickly pear, how it travels to South Africa and the Cape in the 18th and 19th century, and then becomes really important to local communities and poor communities of locals as a crop, as a way of making cash along the side by selling the fruit, and as an instrument, as a source for a kind of beer that's fermented at home, that creates community, that creates income for women who prepare this. And at the same time, prickly pear is taking off, and it's seen as a pest for improved landscapes destined for agriculture or for foraging. And then in the 30s, just as with Kudzu, you have a massive biological control campaign using a couple of insects, cochineal and a moth, the Cactoblastis moth. And so you see this ebb and flow of the plants in the landscape and how it means different things to different communities. So I wouldn't even be able to say in that very complex mosaic whether the balance of proof is it's bad because the big landowners consider it a pest, or it's good because it's playing this really important role within the local community, and how that changes over time as well, how the plant finds new uses. So I really can't get away from this idea that we have to look, and any historical moment is really messy and mixed. And it's only in retrospect that I think the lines are becoming really, really clear. I could say more about refugees in Greece but I think I'll stop here because I'm also thinking by allowing something to fester, you also create the political conditions for animosity, for aggression, for these violent fantasies of eradicating plants or people. So that itself is a conscious, I think, choice, political, cynical choice.
I agree, and also labels play important roles in that, in those mappings of what must be eradicated and for what reasons, and the map becomes more and more complicated, of course. So we can look at questions that have been left here for you, and also if anyone wants to ask a question just through the microphone, that's also a possibility. But I'm going to read the first one, and this one is from Luisa Teixeira Costa. Hi, Yota, thank you very much for your talk. Do you know if or how the migrant people you mentioned from Turkey built connections with the agave plants? Were the agave plants used and or cultivated by these communities in any way?
Thank you, Luisa, for your question. I'm not familiar with the use of agave in Greece, for example, to produce fermented beverages or in cooking. It's more of I think, a plant curiosity that escaped and thrived in the landscape. Prickly pear, as Giovanni said, is a feature of the landscape. It's beautiful. It's infiltrated not only the landscape, but also Greek poetry and Greek visual culture. And that is an edible fruit that we make sweets with, we make jam, but I don't think that the refugees developed a special connection with agave. I will look more.
And a question from Nesreen Urisa. Did the Anatolian Greeks who resettled in Greece following the Greco-Turkish population exchange bring with them any plant seeds from their former hometowns in Anatolia?
That's another great question. So a lot of that movement, a lot of the displacement happened even before the Treaty of Lausanne. It was very chaotic. It was very violent. If they brought seeds, it must have been less of a premeditated gesture and more of a I'm going to bring this with me because it's available right next to me, and I'm in a rush and I want to bring something from home. But what they did bring with them were their recipes, their culture, the use of spices that were often different from what mainland Greeks would eat. And so I think it was especially through the culture of food that they brought with them that they established themselves and transformed Greek cuisine, as I mentioned. So it was through food cultures, and I think the role of plants as connectors and as carriers of memory and carriers of family traditions through food was a very important component in how they transplanted themselves and established themselves and transformed the place they arrived at.
To the point, Yota, back looping this back to the good and bad, right, of the plant world. I think that this question and your answer also reminded me of recent conversations I've witnessed at conferences where there seems to be still an insistence because of the colonial framework, which of course it's always important to bring to the fore, but it should not become our only lens of inquiry, I believe. But there's a sort of ease with which the blame is very, very frequently placed on very wealthy colonizers or settlers or collectors who meddled, like princes and princesses who wanted this plant via this other, bring it over to their property, to their gardens, and then this plant wreaks havoc in India or other colonized lands. And while those narratives are very important, and I've sat through talks that clearly point at culprits that are grounded in colonialist histories, I noticed that the very important histories of migrants constantly shifting seeds in ways that are less perhaps historicized, in the sense that they're less documented and therefore less traceable into our archives, go completely unmentioned. So we sometimes create a skewed image in which it is only colonialist settlers that meddled with ecology, while migrants have always brought around seeds with them. It's just what we do. I count myself in, as whenever you move to another country, you crave the company and the presence of those plants that you're familiar with from home. And as long as the climate allows, something is bound to take. So I wanted to move on. There's more questions. Yes, please go ahead.
I'll just add, Giovanni, to your point that it's the same. I think when we think about the domestication of plants and the seeds that now sustain us, we often think of the big companies and the genetic engineering happening at that scale. But they are the small acts of preservation and experimentation of indigenous communities and of small farmers, smallhold farmers, right? That
yes,
contributed to the crops that sustain us today.
Absolutely. So there's maybe time has come for also expanding and fragmenting a little the colonialist framework, not to erase it, but to fit more into the spaces that naturally exist there that have been overlooked. Ginger Brooks, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm curious if the term introduced might be used as opposed to invasive in critical plant studies, or if there are other terms.
Giovanni, you can speak to this as well. Yes, absolutely. I think there is introduced, there is aggressive, which distinguishes the personality of a plant in a specific
Mhm.
ecological context. I was thinking about this before the talk and whether, to hedge a little bit or use, but I like the provocation of invasives. I think it forces us to contend with the most negative, the most bad, to use Giovanni's word, aspect of this relationship with plants. And also, I showed you the report from 2023. It's still a term that's very current in the sphere of policy. And if we want to be in conversation, I think it's important to kind of have a common language to a certain point if we want the humanities to come and start informing more of these conversations.
I agree with that. One term that springs to mind right now, although it's slightly different, as they all are, of course, from each other, is a volunteer plant, which tends to be a welcome migrant plant in the sense that it might appear in a garden and the volunteer is this, it could be a begonia or another cultivar that has not been planted intentionally, but has just showed up. Or like, for instance, in my garden, where I have planted some native species, but others have showed up, like goldenrod showed up, and I just make sure that goldenrod has more and more space every year. That would be a case of a volunteer plant that's very welcome. So maybe there's room here to develop a lexicon of plant positionality, right? That could be very interesting, and actually put it down. Then maybe that's an essay we should be writing.
And an inspiring approach to gardening, right? How do you create a collaboration?
Yes, because once we develop these lexicons, for as much as sometimes I want to resist the power of the word as this omnipotent drive that commands and defines our lives, I think we can open up spaces. We can open up places for not seeing goldenrod in your yard as a weed or dandelion in your yard just as a weed, but as a volunteering plant that it's actually helpful to an ecosystem and looks pretty. So you start kind of like pulling off all these layers of prejudice in a sense that blind us to the importance of these other species as well. More question here, Sarah Jenkins. Is one of the problems that we don't have an informed relationship with invasives? When they are new, the majority of people don't understand their value. People have always managed ecosystems, but in the case of migrants, the locals don't know how to manage it.
Definitely, that sounds very plausible to me. It speaks also to the predicament of many of us who are so far removed from the sources of our food or the sources of, the sustenance through plants in the landscape, that we're not really experimenting and playing around with a newcomer. And I think both in the case of prickly pear in South Africa and in the case of kudzu, indigenous communities actually reached out for the plant and kind of included it in their experimentation, in their cuisine, in ways that were much more advanced in time. The rest of us perhaps were just looking at the plant as an alien, as an intruder. But this idea of being open to new uses or integration of the plant. But you have to have that intimacy with plants in general, I think, to feel comfortable doing that.
Yeah, and also I'm just gonna keep whatever I'd like to say very short to read more questions, but immigration always happens. There's always a kind of moment that sometimes is more visible with the arrival, and then the way the immigration wave sort of integrates itself or morphs over time is really the telling of the entwinement that we can't. I think at the beginning of immigration, there's also always this kind of like potential for intersection that can be traumatic or that can be difficult. It's part of the movement, right? Catherine Sadalski, hello, Catherine. Regarding the ethics of intervention, in Thoreau's Being, Michael Marder argues that weeds blur the line between cultivation and wildness. In your view, do plants like kudzu force us to question when human control tips into domination and when restraint becomes a form of ecological respect?
This is interesting because I'm not sure whether to engage with this question from the perspective of humans or the plant. The plant does not appear to respect boundaries. It doesn't. I mean, there is. If we think about restraint from the perspective of the human, there is often this arrogance that we bring to our interventions, assuming that we understand the whole of the ecological complexity of a situation or a problem. And that's why I gave you this quote from Hugh Bennett. Like, he was absolutely convinced that kudzu was not going to become an invasive, even though David Fairchild, who was instrumental in so many plant introductions into the US, was growing it in his garden here in DC and was sounding the alarm. But there was this sense of scientific confidence that we know this plant. So definitely restrained in terms of our always partial, always situated knowledge, I think is called for. What's interesting with kudzu is that it's lack of restraint that makes it a villain, and yet it's very much mirroring the disruption of ecosystems and the loss of habitat due to human-driven change in the Anthropocene. So it's really holding up a mirror, as I said, to some of these tendencies to take over all the space, to invade, to dominate, that are tendencies of certain kinds of human societies, agencies. I don't want to say we humans, specific, again, historical, economic, political formations. Giovanni?
I would read the next
Anything to add?
question because I want to give as much space here. Michaela is asking, you mentioned the invasive alien species report. I'm interested to know, in the era of climate change, how will non-human forms such as the earth and plants adapt, outlive, and eventually overtake the architecture and objects created by humans? Can you imagine a future landscape many years after the presence of humans?
Another wonderful question. I think it's the artists who are imagining that for us. I think part of the very strong hold power of Okoyomon's installation is that it does present itself as almost this post-apocalyptic landscape. It's inside a weathered building. It looks like humans may have departed a long time ago. And so when you walk into that space as a visitor, it's almost a form of time travel that I experience. I don't know, Giovanni, if you had the same impression. I get the same impression in some installations by Anselm Kiefer, where he uses plants, desiccated plants, herbarium specimens. It's almost like the artist is transporting you into that future environment where our species perhaps has become extinct and other species are taking over and developing their own ecological relationships without us. And so a lot of that, I think, ecological grief that I may feel in those spaces is also grief for my own future absence from the scene and from our own species eventually becoming absent from the scene. I'll just say I find it both troubling and very consoling when I talk to plant scientists, evolutionary biologists like Ned Friedman at Harvard, who comes and teaches also at our, like Giovanni, in our summer program. And he always reassures me that in a million years, biodiversity will be flourishing again and everything will be okay with the plant world. In a million years, it will all have sprung back. The question is, how do we make sure we remain part of that rich, beautiful world?
Thank you, Yota. Paul, am I right that our time has run out?
Yeah, right. Thank you. These hours go so quickly, and there was such an amazing conversation. I know there's a lot of questions that we didn't get to, but I just want to thank everyone. Thanks so much to Yota and Giovanni for sharing your thoughts and perspectives with us today, and thank you to the audience members for sharing so many really stimulating questions. This program has been one of a series of events from the Plant Initiative about the human-plant connection. And our next program is going to be on Tuesday, December 2nd, and will feature Indigenous Métis herbalist Lori Ann Bird talking about her new book, Revered Roots, Ancestral Teachings of Wild, Edible, and Medicinal Plants. And stay tuned for more details. Again, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to access this if you missed part of the program, and it's a public recording as well. So thanks to everyone for attending today. And if you'd like to support these types of programs from the Plant Initiative, we're always appreciative of donations through our website. So thanks very much to everyone for participating today.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Giovanni. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you for attending.